All right, so let's talk about the next two chapters of The Body Keeps the Score. And everybody recommended this book. I'm really pleasantly surprised how much I like it. So I don't, they're in different sections, but like both of these chapters kind of go together with the brain. I almost kind of feel like they should be in the same section. But he gets a little technical, but you know, uh, I think the examples are good, especially like he talks about a case. So basically, one of his clients was, a mother and picked her kid up from school, noticed that her seatbelt wasn't shut. And so she reached over to shut her seatbelt and went through a light and was in an accident. And not only lost her daughter, but she was pregnant at the time and lost that as well. So she went from being a very positive, outgoing individual to, of course, not only being going through grief and loss, but a lot of self-blame and shame. And but one of the things that he started talking about in both of these chapters is the experience of the symptomology in PTSD. So when we think, so one of the organizations that I donate a lot to, it's called Pets for Vets. And, I had always, because I told you the story about my dad probably having PTSD and being in World War II. And, it did affect the family's life quite a bit. But I always noticed that he always had a dog. And it wasn't a service dog, but he was always more relaxed when the dog was with him. And he eventually the dog was with him all the time. And so I noticed the impact that those animals had on him. And so after he died, we decided that people could donate to Pets for Vets, and they train dogs depending on what the member of the service needs, and everybody may need different things. So there's all different levels of training, and for different types of service dogs. Technically, there's 4 different types of service dogs, but so one of the, I'm not sure why I brought that up, but I'll think of it. So the symptomology, that's why I brought it up. So what actually happens in the symptomology of PTSD is after a trauma, and they didn't know why this occurred. Many times, the most common symptomology would be a racing heart, high blood pressure, sweating, nervousness and anxiety, and often depression too, but talking about symptomology that comes on at specific times. Could be the result of a loud noise, external stress, a surprise, like being in a going shopping for food, and how there's aisles of food and not knowing what's around the aisle. And if you have a service dog, the dog looks around the aisle and looks back, and it's like a calming thing. There's no more unknown. And even the 4th of July, that's a huge time for veterans to experience post-traumatic stress disorder symptomology. But when you put all of these symptoms together, one of the number one medications that veterans receive from the VA are beta blockers, and a beta blocker regulates the heartbeat. So not only if you have a minor defibrillation, but primarily a racing heartbeat. So what those beta blockers do is that when people have those physical symptoms, that medication often tones them down a bit, but it doesn't solve the problem. It's not a medication you could take and get cured. It's always there. You'd always be on those medications. And then the next symptomology, and the one they really bring up in the book in combination with those physical symptoms, are flashbacks. And sometimes they were earlier called both auditory and sight hallucinations. So when you have that combination, it was really difficult for psychologists or counselors to know how to treat that. And the old way of treating it was simply to process the trauma. But that almost reinforced the trauma sometimes. And so, I think it's interesting that the author and other psychiatrists and psychologists and doctors started to look at the physical side of this and, hey, wondering what is actually happening in the brain. And of course, their discoveries followed technological discoveries. So, over the last 40 years, we've had CAT scans, PET scans, MRIs, 2 versions of MRIs. And with each different technological advance, we were able to learn more, not only about physical injuries, but about the functioning of our own minds. Before they had these, one of the only ways they could learn was by taking the vitals, or sometimes they learned through brain surgery. So they learned, of course, that there were no nerve endings in the brain. So somebody could be wide awake while they were having brain surgery. As they moved through, if they were removing a tumor or cauterizing an aneurysm or something like that, and they touched different parts of the brain, they would activate different responses, whether it would be a language response, it could be a memory, it could be perhaps they had a professional violinist and they didn't want to harm them in a way that it would prevent them from playing the violin. So they had them play the violin the entire time they were having surgery. And if they went to a wrong part of the brain or got too close to something and she would make a mistake, they knew not to touch that part of the brain, basically. Sometimes, you know, if it's life-threatening, things have to be done. I've met many people who have had brain surgery, and it has affected them in very different ways, depending on where tumors were or aneurysms, where they were in the brain. So once they were able to invent the technology to look at basically when basically there was an electrochemical reaction in the brain. So when, you know, dendrites were firing and neurons were working, and you know, so when different parts of the brain had more going on in it, you know, they were able to do some experiments. And I thought that these tests were pretty well thought out and revealing. So the example they gave of the case of the grieving mom who was in the car accident, they gave another case of a couple who was in a car accident who the trauma affected them very differently. One of them had all the PTSD symptomology and flashbacks, and his wife basically disassociated and shut down and had no mental response when the thought of the trauma came up. So people respond differently to trauma, not only psychologically, but physically as well. So as they were going through, you know, these tests, he had 8 clients who had experienced trauma, and he asked them if they wanted to volunteer to take an MRI while they were listening to their story being read to them, a recording of it. And they all volunteered because they wanted to help other people who had experienced trauma. And so what they found out was that the first thing they noticed was that when the trauma was being read to the client in the MRI, they re-experienced the trauma as if it was happening. So it's different than just memory. It's a different perception of being stuck in time during that flashback moment. They knew that they were re-experiencing it, not only because of what they were thinking, what they were told, but because of all the physical symptomology that came about as they were reading. So they had a racing heart, they were sweating, all kinds of stuff. They had an emotional reaction, except for the woman who dissociated. And then after they determined, okay, this was real, this is happening, then they looked at the brain scans. MRIs are great. I had one. I'm going to go look. I'm going to contact the hospital and see if I can get it on a DVD, because now that they have 3D printers, I always wanted a 3D print of my own skull to put on my desk. So it's like it would be looking at me. And just a little Buddhist reminder of my own mortality and to live life for each day. And but if I can get my MRI, I can give that DVD to a certain company and they'll print my skull. Just a tangent there. I mean, it would be really cool if I could have it like laser cut into like a giant piece of crystal, like Indiana Jones, but you know. Can't ask for everything. So then they get a little technical once they start looking at brain scans, you know. So I don't want to get into all the deep details of the different parts of the brain, but I think there were really three primary parts that we have to focus on. And, so I think he talks about basically evolutionary, how the brain developed in stages, and how even somebody, as they are forming in the womb and as we grow as human beings, how our brains develop as well in stages. And, so when we think about, basically the more primitive parts of the brain, we think about limbic system, and so when we think about the limbic system, that's where our emotions are held or come from. And when we think about our emotions are really a reaction to an experience or a phenomena that is happening. And humans have a broad range of emotions. We have positive emotions too, but some of the most primitive emotions are fight, flight, or freeze. So, we have emotions to really, those primal emotions were there to help us to survive, basically. And, if there was, a car that skid in our lane, we automatically shut down the other parts of our brain because the limbic system takes control and we react physically to, that impending disaster. So I've experienced this myself. I was on a trip with one of my friends, Jim, and we were having a good conversation, and all of a sudden, there was almost an accident, and it was almost as if my cognitive part kind of let the other parts of my brain take control. So I was like physically reacting so that the car didn't wreck. And then as soon as we were able to stop and we were safe, then we talked again. But it was almost like this little cutscene where, everything changed. I have my own theory with adrenaline as well. So he talks about adrenaline in the book and when a trauma actually happens. And he says when people, continually re-experience the trauma through flashbacks, it's almost as if the part of their brain that regulates time shuts down as well. And it seems like this torture lasts or this trauma lasts forever. But one thing I've noticed a few times in my life, and it's usually in cars, but other times too, I did notice that when I had that fight or flight response, and my limbic system kicked in, and inside the limbic system, you've got the amygdala, and it's saying, hey, I'm going to pump out all these chemicals so that you can react immediately without having to analyze it. So, the higher functioning part of our brains also shut down, and they go with the more primitive parts. But one of the chemicals, other than cortisol, that's pumped out is adrenaline. And every time it really, you might have heard this, maybe you experienced this, but every time I was almost in an accident, it seemed like slow motion. And, uh, I think that one thing that happens is that the normal timekeeping part of our brain shuts down to some degree. And the chemical of adrenaline changes that perception. So that if you think about it, if we're in crisis and we have to react quickly, if a if everything if our perception moves to slow motion, it actually gives us more time to react to the immediate danger. So it that change in time perspective actually allows us to physically react in in a better way. Gives us a little extra millisecond or something. So one of the things, he has a section on speechless horror. And I noticed this myself, that it shuts down the language part of our brain as well. And when we're experiencing some type of trauma and we need to react. But as they're experiencing these flashbacks, it's almost as if they're unable to process what had happened with the cognitive parts of our brain. So they call that the lower road or the higher roads. The lower road goes to the lower portions of our brain, which are the more primitive parts of our brain, closer to our brain stem. And, they were parts of our brain that were formed first. Some people might call it the reptilian brain. That's not really popular anymore, but our more primitive parts. So if our brains think, hey, this is your life's in danger, it's going to take the lower road and let the more primitive brain take over. So we're not really processing what happened at a more cognitive level. Technically, once the traumatic event is over, so let's say we're being attacked by saber-toothed tiger or something, and everything goes into slow motion and we react and hit the tiger with a club and we run away. And then we catch our breath, we're safe, we're up a tree or in our cave or whatever, we're safe, it's gone. And then we think about what happened and we process it, and our brain is reset. But that doesn't happen if there's a situation that we can't escape. So, if our body goes into fight or flight and we don't escape whatever's happening, or it happens multiple times, or maybe we're being held down, or maybe we're trapped in a car, or whatever happens that's so horrible that creates the trauma, we don't process it cognitively in the same way afterward. Our body continuously thinks that we're still experiencing the trauma. So
I have a question.
Yeah.
So I had an interesting conversation. Can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Make sure. Okay, cool. I had an interesting conversation with my friend because something had just happened and we were just having like in depth, and without like sharing the whole story, I had said it like, it sounds like you haven't processed the trauma that happened X, Y, or Z when this happened. And she turned around and she was like, yeah, but what does that even mean? And it's like, we say that so much that you have to process, but, and I just paused for a second because I was like, well, I guess it can mean different things for different, like, depending on the situation. So I think I did a decent job responding, but I'm curious, if someone were to be like, okay, what does that mean to process? How would you answer that?
Yeah, and I think that's really what these two chapters are about. So I think you're getting at what his final point is. And I think the crux of what he's writing about is that you can process it two ways, either the top down or the bottom up. And when he says that, I didn't understand it when he first said it. What he's really referring to, top down, is kind of like the upper portions of our brain, or the more cognitive part that can analyze things. And if we're feeling safe, and if we are in control of our bodies and minds, so that we're not going to have a flashback in therapy, we can process it through talk therapy cognitively. We can analyze what happened. We can say it's over, we're safe now. But he's also saying that if people experience severe trauma and still going through flashbacks, talk therapy probably won't work. So the traditional method of going from the top of our brain, the cognitive analyzing part, down to the limbic system and dealing with it that way. He's saying if people are experiencing PTSD and all this symptomology and having flashbacks, traditional talk therapy probably won't work for them. So that's the first part of the answer. So then the second part is, what about the other method, moving from the bottom of our brains, like that emotional limbic system, up and resetting our brains, basically. And he's saying sometimes that's the only thing that we can do to process it, is to kind of reset our brains. And he's going to talk about how to do that in later chapters. But, some of the ways I know are like EMDR and, some of the desensitization through like, what do you call those? Virtual reality. So it's a different type of desensitization. It's actually placing us in virtual reality environment. But yeah, so there's a lot of new methods to process it a different way. So I think those are his two answers. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
No, it does. Because I was like, because we learn all these different ways to process, but then for someone that's just like, I guess I was like looking, I was like, there is no simple answer on how to process. Like, it really is depending on the situation and who they are as a person. And I can speak to like how I process things through art, or like I've done that like several different ways, but it came down. I think I really like processing things and kind of almost rewriting that narrative and understanding where I was. And so I spoke to some of those experiences. But yeah, it was just an interesting like moment where I just was trying to simplify everything I learned into like a simple answer, and I wasn't able to do it.
Yeah, that's okay though. But I think you're thinking about it the right way. And I think that you know, I think it really depends on the severity of the PTSD symptoms. If they're having flashbacks and they could have that, they could re-experience it by talking about the trauma. If they re-experience all those physical symptoms and the emotional symptoms, then talk therapy may not be the best option. Even EMDR combines talking with the actual eye movement. So it's, none of them are without talking, but I think some of these other methods, the more I read about them and experience them, and I had EMDR done to me, and I was like, I forgot about it, but then like a semester later, the lady said, "Hey, how'd that EMDR work?" And I'm like, wow, I have not thought about that traumatic event for a semester. But so I was kind of sold on it then. I just want to share some of the things that I thought were interesting, and you can share what you thought was interesting with me in your discussion board. But they talked about some of the more primitive senses being part of the limbic system. And the book doesn't talk about this, but it reminded me of it. And one of the most primitive senses is smell. And smell actually brings back the most powerful memories. We might think it's like seeing something or maybe listening to a song. Wow, that's a powerful memory, sound. But the most powerful memories are brought back by the sense of smell. And so I think that I can give you a personal example. Like when I was a little kid and my mom and dad were dressing up to go on a date or to a party or something, my mom would always wear this kind of cheap perfume called Charlie. And my dad will always wear like Old Spice. And even to this day, if I ever smell them, I'm immediately taken back to that memory of my parents dressing up when I was a little child. When I smell, like if a truck goes by and there's a lot of diesel exhaust, and I smell that diesel exhaust, it takes me back to my time in India because, there were no catalytic converters and there was a lot of exhaust if you're in one of the cities. And the so in France, so I know a lot about like perfume because my brother like designs and sells perfume. But he so there's all different levels of perfume. Like there's cologne, there's perfume, there's eau de toilette. And all it means is that there's more essential oils or less essential oils in each one. But when perfume got started, they didn't sell a brand of perfume. The closest they had were like spices and herbs. So like they would use cloves or vanilla or something like that. But the wealthy in society would go to a perfumery and they would do an inventory of what they liked and their personality, and they would have samples of individual oils, and they would mix their own perfume, or it was basically perfume for both guys and girls, but they would mix them their own. And once they decided on a personal fragrance, they would never use that same mixture for another person. And the reason for that is because when they met people, the people would smell their perfume and nobody else would smell like them. So that would be part of their sensory memory. And if they passed them on a street, they would know who it was. And so everybody had their, what they called their signature scent. And nobody else had the same scent. And they, and then so that also, if somebody was dating or something like that, and they were forming memories, like good positive memories, they would always associate that person's scent with the positive memory that they made together. So it's kind of interesting that what flashbacks can, I guess, be triggered by. It could be a smell, it could be a sound, could be a song, it could be, like I said, the 4th of July, fireworks. But if you think about all of our senses, flashbacks could be triggered by any of our senses. So it could be the texture of a fabric. It could be the texture of a seatbelt, if you were in an accident or something like that. So there's all different things, and it could be with any of our senses. Let's see. I thought it was interesting that they talked about, the left and the right side of the brain, and the left hemisphere is deactivated and the right side of the hemisphere is more active when during trauma and flashbacks. And when they talked about this, I thought it was pretty interesting. Let's see what else. So let's look at the next chapter. This is where it made me think of art therapy, because he talked about the child who had viewed, the World Trade Center and the plane crashing into it and people jumping out of the windows and the fire. And the child drew a picture of it and showed it to him. And there was a black circle at the bottom, and he asked, "What's the black circle?" And he said, "It's a trampoline so that whoever jumped out would be saved." So the child had done some processing at the cognitive and creative level. I think the other interesting thing is that the more primitive parts of our brain are the emotional, and that's kind of a reaction to an experience, but the more cognitive part of our brain is also the creative part of our brain. So the creative part of our brain has more to do with empathy. I always thought it might be the more feeling part of our brain, but the more primitive part of our brain feels, and the more advanced part of our brain is empathic. And that's because we actually have to imagine ourselves in the other person's shoes. We have to imagine the other person's feelings. We have to imagine ourselves as that other individual experiencing that feeling. So it's a little further along than our own emotion. It adds this creative aspect to the empathic experience. So being traumatized means continuing to organize your life as if the trauma was still going on. And it means that we're not truly living in the present. We're continually reliving the past. And that affects every aspect of our lives and the other people in our lives. I just want to talk about the different responses that couple had. So here's just a tidbit of my weird information. So, they talk about, the medial prefrontal cortex, and that's kind of like in between and above our eyes, and a lot of not scientists, but I don't know, new age kind of people think that's where we got the concept of the third eye. That's why people in India, that dot that Indians wear, that symbolizes the third eye, or the eye of intuition. Yeah, so Stan, and I'm not sure how to pronounce UTE, but Ute. And they were the ones in the other traffic accident. Stan had the flashbacks just like his other clients, but his wife shut down all emotions and basically kind of depersonalized, and she found unconsciously that was the way she dealt with the trauma. But and she just said, I felt just like I felt at the time of the accident, just like he did, but the way she dealt with the accident was she felt nothing. So two totally different responses to trauma. Yeah, so I think in future chapters, I think he will be talking not so much about the top-down talking therapy that we're used to, but some of the methods to reset from those bottom, more primitive parts of our brain, to reset them so that we're not continually re-experiencing the trauma psychologically. Anybody want to share, if anybody's read it yet, anybody want to share any responses or thoughts? Anybody have any reactions? You're going to put it in your discussion board, but anybody want to talk about anything?
I just started work at a women's shelter, and we had a meeting today, and we talked about this thing about both sides of the brain and how important it is to have that creative process, because most of the women that come into the shelter are from domestic abuse, and they just are kind of basket cases in some ways. But and I was explaining my side of it as an artist, and also having studied art therapy. I think 14 hours, but that when I paint, when I draw, when I create, you literally can feel your brain kind of coming together like this. And it releases all my stress, helps me figure out problems, and I walk away with a better sense of wholeness. So that was the most important thing I think I learned from these readings. And just like the little boy who drew the picture of the trampoline on the bottom of that picture, I mean, wow, if you think about it, he wanted to save the people, and the only way he could process that was through a drawing, and finding a way to offer his way of dealing with traumatic incidents. So to me, creativity, whether it's music or exercise or anything that you're doing outside of the inside of your head, is going to benefit I mean, even taking walks with each other and talking does more than just sitting there talking to each other. So I don't know. That was my favorite part of this reading.
Yeah, that's what resonated with you.
Yeah.
And when we create any type of art, and I mean, like, could be writing, could be painting, could be sculpture, could be music, writing music or playing music. One of the things that the act of creating does is it brings us more fully into the present moment. We're not thinking about the past or the future, but it brings us into the present. So even if we're processing the past, we're creating this and processing it in the present, in the now. And one of the things that most creative people express is that maybe somebody starts painting in the morning and it's the end of the day and they finish their painting and they've totally lost track of time throughout the day because they're experiencing the now present more fully. So, yeah. All right. I will be looking forward to reading all of your discussion boards and yeah.
Okay, so I actually enjoyed the way you explained processing of trauma. But when you talked about processing the trauma from up to down, like it makes sense. You were talking about from the cognitive part of the brain down to the limbic system, which is like body responses. You also mentioned like processing it from the down part to the brain. I was actually thinking it was meant to be like from the limbic system to the brain, like how the person reacts like physically before like trying to tell the brain you have to like change the way you're processing this situation. Or
Yeah, so he actually talks about let me see what it's called. So basically, he says that I didn't really get into all the different parts, but basically the thalamus, which is kind of the middle part, regulates basically whether to go up or down, whether to send it to kind of our cognitive processing or our more primitive emotional processing. It can actually send it to both. It gets to the emotional part, the more primitive part, a little faster. So, you know, if we start with the emotional part and work our way up, bottom to up, that's really more like resetting our brains. And that's all the new techniques. That's like EMDR and everything like that. And he'll probably teach us some more things. But if we start with the thalamus and it goes up to the prefrontal cortex, which is kind of like our analytical brain, and we want to like make sense of it, you know, then that is more like you know, we're going to talk about it and process what happened through like all of the skills you learned, like Gestalt and everything else, you know. But he says if you're experiencing like severe flashbacks, that might not work. Yeah.
so what do you want? If talk therapy doesn't work, is there like an enhanced technique you have to use for this individual?
Yeah, so that's like EMDR. And you know, there's also they have tapping but he's going to discuss that. Yeah, in future chapters. So stay tuned. All right. We will see you all later.